In this topic, we'll be talking about data redaction, or in other words, entity anonymization. When working with text data, there are many cases when we have to hide certain information, maybe because it's private data, or maybe because it contains information we don't wish to be known to other people who are reading through the records. Now, in order to conceal that information and hide it in a manner that makes sense when we read the anonymized record, we have to identify the information first and also label what type of information it is. That's why we need entity extraction before entity anonymization. So in the record on this slide here, we see that we've identified some names, locations, an address, a date, some facilities, and so on. And we may wish to anonymize them in different ways and make sure the reader still understands what the record states, even if it's anonymized. Here's an example of how this record could be anonymized. We can choose to substitute the names of people with some fake names. For example, we see that the name Aaron Coleman in the top record becomes Vontel McCallum in the anonymized record. Now, notice how Aaron Coleman has the same fake name throughout the records for consistency. And this is possible because we've already identified him as an entity. We've also substituted the real address in our record with a fake address, but we've anonymized the facilities by using the word facility followed by a string of alphanumeric characters. Locations, on the other hand, are anonymized using a simple string of text, and the same goes for the time and day in the record. So let's talk about all these different anonymization options that we have available in PolyAnalyst. First, we can replace an entity with some specified text, just like we saw with the time and the location data. Second, we can anonymize with an encryption pattern. So we can use a word like facility, and the system will auto-generate an alphanumeric string that's unique to that specific entity, so that no two facilities will have the same pattern. Third, we can replace each letter or digit in our entity with any character we choose. We didn't have any cases like this in our previous example, but here's an example of a phone number where each digit has been replaced with an X. Finally, we can replace an entity using another entity. We do this by using dictionaries, and that's how we can have our fake names and addresses in the previous example. Now, in order to use this option, we usually need a phrase dictionary that contains these fake names or addresses. And for anonymizing the standard people entities specifically, PolyAnalyst allows us to use its built-in human name dictionaries. So just to give you an idea of what the node properties look like, here's the properties of the entity anonymization node. You see on the left a list of all the entities you can anonymize, and on the right you have the 4 different anonymization options we have discussed. But what's really interesting about PolyAnalyst is that it not only allows us to anonymize the complete entity, which is whatever text was extracted by the entity rule, but it also anonymizes attributes of the entity. So down here on the right, there's an option we can click, and then it'll expand a specific entity with all its attributes. And from here we can choose to anonymize any attributes we want. This is particularly helpful in cases such as the name Officer Wyatt Davis that we saw in our example text record. So the people entity identifies Officer Wyatt Davis as an entity, where Wyatt is the first name, Davis is the last name, and officer is saved as the value for the attribute category. Now, if we only want to anonymize the first and last name and not the attribute officer, we'll choose to anonymize attributes and anonymize just the first name and last name attributes, but not the entire entity. So let's now move on to a hands-on exercise where we'll practice anonymizing some data. In this hands-on practice, we'll go over how to perform data redaction using the Entity Anonymization node. Now, the data we'll be working with here is a series of example insurance claim records, and our goal is to anonymize the names that appear in these records. So before we anonymize anything, we first need to run the Entity Extraction node to extract standard entities like people names, which we've done already. And if we open this node, we see that the system found 7 people name entities in our data set. Now, before we anonymize this data, we have one more entity we'd like to extract. We want to identify the claimant and the insured party in these claims and extract those as custom entities. And because these custom entities depend on the people entities we already extracted, we needed to set this up as a separate entity extraction node connected to the standard entity extraction node here. If we click on the custom entity extraction node here, we can see that the system extracted the claimant and the insured party for 5 of the names. The other 2 names were just internal claim personnel assigned to handle each claim. Okay, so now we're ready to anonymize the names of the parties involved in these claim records. We do this by using the Entity Anonymization node, which is already connected here for us. So let's go into the properties of the Entity Anonymization node. In the Options tab here, we see all the entities are on the left. And we can select each type of entity and specify what method we'd like to use to anonymize that type. Let's test things out on the people entity. So we select this entity on the left, and then we can choose which method of anonymization on the right. Let's first try replacing text. For this option, we simply type what we want to see appear in the records in place of the original text. Now let's execute and see what this looks like. We see in the results a column with the original text right next to a column with the anonymized version. And if we click on some records, we see that every time a person's name shows up, it's replaced with the text we specified. Let's try another method and go back into the node properties. This time, let's replace each letter with a symbol. And if we execute the node, we can see how the results change. Now what we see is that each letter of the names in these records is replaced by an asterisk. So this and the previous method are helpful in some scenarios, but notice how we lose a lot of information. We no longer know if the people referred to in these records are the same person or different people. So if we want to keep that type of information as we anonymize, we can use a different method of anonymization. So let's go back into the node properties. Okay, so let's now anonymize people names using an encryption pattern. When we select this option, without changing anything, PolyAnalyst will assign a number that's unique to that person entity. And if we want, we can add a little more information, such as person. This way, if we anonymize other things, like locations, we can keep track of the type of entity that was anonymized, so we don't lose that information. Now, let's execute the node and look at the results. So now we see that all the names are replaced by unique values. And names like Rita Skeeter that appear in multiple records are replaced with the same number, so we don't lose that information. Okay, now let's say you only want to anonymize a specific attribute of an extracted entity. We can do this by selecting the entity on the left, and then we select the Anonymize Attributes checkbox here. This allows us to choose to anonymize specific attributes of that entity. For example, let's say I only want to anonymize the last names of the people. So we just select that option, specify the method, and we can execute to view the results. So now we see that just the last names are anonymized in the records. Okay, so let's go over our last method of anonymization. Let's open the node properties again and go over how to replace an entity with another entity. Let's go back to our people entity and anonymize the first and last names with a different entity. So let's go to the last name and choose the fourth option here. Now for this one, we'll need to select a phrase dictionary that contains our replacement entities. If we click here, we have access to PolyAnalyst's human name dictionaries. And here we can choose the default human names dictionary and then click OK. Now let's do the same for the first name attributes of the people entities. Okay, let's execute the node and look at our results. And if we look at the anonymized records here, we see that the names from our default name dictionary has replaced the originals. Now because the people entity is a standard entity, we had access to PolyAnalyst's default human names dictionary. But how about when we have a custom entity, or maybe we just want to specify our own replacement entities from a separate phrase dictionary? So let's go back into the node properties and anonymize our custom entities. Now let's go down to our custom entities for party. And let's choose the fourth anonymization option again. Now this time, you'll notice that we don't see the default human names dictionary pop up. We only have the option to select a phrase dictionary. And if we click on the phrases dictionary, we see a list that we can choose from. Let's select this one here that we created with some fake names. Now let's execute and see the results. So here we see that our custom entities have been replaced with our other entities. Now, after we're done with our anonymization, we can just use a Modify Columns node to drop the column with our non-anonymized names. And this concludes our topic on entity anonymization. Up next, we'll go over some ways to refine our XPDL output by using XPDL functions.